Welcome to the World Copper Podcast. I'm Andy Shaw in Australia, and I'm joined this evening, my time, by Simon Hunt of Simon Hunt Strategic Services and Juan Carlos Guajardo of Plus Mining in Santiago. We're in the run-up to CESCO Week, one of the biggest copper events on the calendar in Santiago, and ahead of that important week, we have a little bit of turbulence going on in the world. There's nothing particularly new about that, but the world seems to have become very good at creating turbulence. And we were discussing a little bit earlier, what do you call this? Is it the Iran crisis, the Gulf crisis, or whatever? But it's very hard for us, without knowing in which direction things will go next, it's very hard for us, looking at the copper market, to ignore that fact, the impacts that's having quite obviously on oil prices and fuel prices. And just as an anecdote, the diesel prices in Australia have gone up to extraordinary levels, not seen for a while. And that's having an impact not just on consumers, on people who say, well, I'm going to walk now rather than drive, or have cancelled my trip, my long road trip, but on farmers, for example, who have a double whammy of running their tractors and their equipment on expensive diesel and now not being able to get things like fertilizers on time. The uncertainties in the world are ever present, but they seem even more uncertain than they were before. Maybe, Simon, we kick off with you first. You and our technical guru, Salman, are in Dubai, and we do wish you to be safe and sound. And my understanding is you're still able to get out and play tennis, which is a good sign. But just give us
we
a quick
this morning,
update
8 o'clock.
Yes.
Humidity was 84, by the way, very unseasonal. Rather than give my own views on what might be the outlook for the Middle East crisis, I'd like to quote two well-known, famous people. The first is Ferguson, who yesterday in the London Times wrote a very good piece in which he said the following: we face the biggest energy shock in our lifetime. In addition, we have a mounting crisis in the opaque realms of private credit, a softening labor market with jobs growth increasingly confined to the healthcare sector, and a central bank in the midst of a leadership transition. The second quote comes from Luke Groman, a very smart and very well-known financial analyst, writing in his weekly report, Three Rings, just a couple of days ago. If Hormuz is closed for another 3 to 4 weeks, we are likely just weeks away from a global credit crisis and economic unwind that will be bigger than 2008 and COVID combined. So I leave the outcome as I see it from Dubai with those two quotes.
Yeah. Well, and it's a dilemma for the Gulf states and their allegiances, and we can come to talk about that in the context of copper, that this plan of the US president, whatever it is forcing people to make decisions at the political level, at the country level, but it's also going to have an impact at the business level as to relationships. And I think that's a podcast in its own right. And just to outdo you on quotes, Simon, there's a gentleman called Helmut von Moltke, who was a Prussian military strategist, and in 1871, which is an important time for what was then called the German Empire, said, he, quote, No plan survives first contact with the enemy. And then Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, I think summed it up much more simply. He said, everyone has a plan until they get hit. So, so plan, and coming even furthering that, Dwight Eisenhower, who a famous military general, but also president for 2 terms, said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. I think what he's getting at there is that you can make plans, but you throw them out the window if they don't quite work out. But the fact that you've actually been planning something means you have adaptability. And I'm not convinced that in this current situation, there's a lot of that going on at the moment. We've talked about this before. I think we're into an era of chaos. Not that the world is entirely stupid, but we are into an era of chaos and uncertainty. And let's come back to what we think that means for our blessed copper industry. Maybe Juan Carlos. Again, we've talked about the tensions, I suppose, from a Chilean perspective of allegiances and where your markets are and where your future markets might be. Is this something that's going to be a hot topic for CESCO Week?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Simon, Andy. You are very well prepared guys. You have quotes to opening the conversation. I have no, sorry, but what I
You're
can
clearly
tell
busier
is
than me.
what can
You
I tell?
don't need quotes, Juan Carlos, because you
Yeah,
have your own quotes.
yeah, but Cisco Week is approaching fast, and of course this uncertainty is very important to address. Um, the first thought is the relevance of supply chains for the industry, and I think Chile is in a remote place of the world and can handle the the supply of inputs in a relatively good way. However, the impact on prices is inevitable. Um, but the second thought here is that this crisis is the second in the last 5 years and after the pandemic. Therefore, in my opinion, mining companies are starting to believe that they need to work on supply chains in a more serious way. It is not longer enough to business as usual. Is not enough to warranty the operations. So my impression is that there will be an strategic review of supply chains to secure operations under stressful situations. And I'm pretty sure these tensions will continue. Allow me one word on the geopolitical situation. We are, as we discussed before, we are in a transition period from a geopolitical perspective. And during this transition period, history says that turbulences are part of the normal situation. So any responsible mining company should take this into consideration, in my view.
So the plans haven't exactly been thrown out the window, but they have learned to adapt a bit more effectively, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But I can go deeper on CESCO Week, and if you want,
Sure.
For those who are not familiar with CESCO Week, CESCO is actually a center, a studies center focused on mining. Was established in the late 80s, a period of big turbulences in Chile for political reasons. And the idea of CESCO was to gather intellectuals that can provide a long-term view for the development of mining sector in Chile. That was the original idea. In the early 90s, the center had the good idea of organizing a big event. And that's the origin of what we know now as CESCO Week, which encompasses main dinner, conferences, and many meetings. So that's what CESCO is right now. And the next week, actually, CESCO Week isn't. It starts officially on April 13. However, meetings start much earlier. What we expect beyond what the geopolitical analysis and the geopolitical consequences, what we do expect in the discussions is how the political changes in Latin America could impact on mining investment and mining operations. We have new governments in Argentina, which changed completely the investment approach to mining. We have important elections this year in Peru and Brazil, two big countries. And in Chile, we are starting a new government, which is also changing the direction of public policy. So I think one of the main questions will be how these changes could impact the mining business in the region.
Do you expect that there will be a full turnout there, given the difficulties of people flying?
Yeah,
I think you were saying the other day that the dinner was sold out weeks and weeks ago.
Every day I received a question from someone that is seeking a seat for dinner, and but it's sold out, no question. So that reflects a big interest. But the logistic problems to come to Chile looks not so serious at the moment.
Yes,
I haven't
moving away from the trouble zone.
Yeah, I haven't heard any cancellation or any problem coming down to Santiago.
No, that's good. That's great.
Obviously, will be from my part of the world.
Yeah, you are in the hotspot, Simon.
Well, you should get on a plane and you play a lot more tennis if you're in Santiago, or at least you play more tennis in a relaxed mode. But coming back to CESCO, you've got a diversity of people coming there. Obviously, miners, smelters for sure, fabricators. I don't know about end users, how many end users go there. It's mostly the supply and the more immediate upstream sort of part of the equation from but there's a lot of investors as well who attend there. And I remember in my days when I did work in the banking sector for a short while, a lot of hedge funds, a lot of investors, and they're looking for answers to pointy questions. What do you think those pointy questions should be if you're an investor attending CESCO Week? What answers do you think they expect to get, or what learnings?
Well, from an investor perspective, let's say financial investor, because we have many investors that are promoting projects, but those who are in the short-term transactions, let's say, they want to know whether Latin America, Chile, could be able to supply fast enough according to the expectations. Yesterday we had the release of the production in February in Chile, which was almost 5% down year on year.
Yeah.
So I think that question specifically is quite topical.
Yes.
Why under these circumstances Chile is not able to accelerate production and actually is going in the other direction? And that's a very interesting question, guys. Simon, Andy, why the industry? Yes.
Can I add to what you've just said? which was a quote from Robert Friedland in
Mhm.
doing an interview with Jeff Curry, because I think what he said was very important. What is the equilibrium price? Even if copper went to $50,000 a ton tomorrow, you won't see an incremental speeding up of material copper supply. It will just take too long to permit, engineer, design, and construct. And there are too many pieces that are needed from the supply chain, like pumps, etc. We have a 38-foot diameter grinding mills. Siemens and ABB will quote 4 years delivery time. Even to get generators for gas turbines for power generation now takes 3 to 4 years. What they are finding now is delivery dates are aspirational because of the scale of resources that go into these things. The supply chains of which are all breaking down, which comes back, Juan Carlos, to what you were saying, is that the mining industry has to focus so much more on its supply chains.
Yes. Yes, we just concluded an analysis of what's the long-term price used in their economic valuation of copper projects in a long, let's say, 10-year period. And it was very interesting to see that the average long-term price 10 years ago, 2015, was around $3 per pound. But now the average is $4.5 per pound. So you had a 50% increase in 10 years in the long-term price assumptions used in the evaluation of projects. So I think that reflects the structural problems the industry is having, and something must happen to change this trend.
We have talked about this before in the sense of the mine supply gap is always there as a hypothetical construct, but in the end, it doesn't exist. It either gets filled by something or it gets removed. And the filled by something is growing mine supply more quickly, which seems to be a pretty big constraint. The other one, which is an interesting one, and we could dedicate a whole podcast to this, of course, is recycling and scrap, which historically has been anomalously low. There's a lot of copper that is basically thrown away. The ICSG released their yearbook, and they put some lovely charts in that. And one of them is the recycling rate, which is hovered around, is slightly declined over time, hovering slightly above 30%, 32%. It does look, it's a hard one to pick, but it does look like it's bottomed out. And that's a global average. So it also reflects places where copper is thrown away into essentially landfill, and then other economies which are now spending a lot of effort on recycling. And the US would be up there. So mature economies that have relatively low, at least first use growth in consumption, are now looking at their urban mine and trying to put it back into the system. And I know that China is spending a lot of time focusing on it. And we've talked about the import situation of scrap coming out of the US and into China. Some of that seems to have got diverted and still ends up in China, but China is surely spending a lot of attention on returning spent scrap or waste into the system. And you'd imagine they will do that very well in the future. The Onahama smelter decision in Japan is an interesting one because they're shutting down the smelting operation in 2027, I believe, but they are maintaining an ability to reprocess material and refine it.
That's very important, Andy. Sorry for interrupting you, but
no, go ahead.
Mitsubishi Materials is shutting down the smelter, but at the same time, they are reinforcing their efforts to go deeper on the recycling business. So you have a strategic decision in a very important Japanese company. So I think we are approaching to certain structural shift in the business for certain companies.
And if I can interrupt, also you mentioned Andy, China. China is really focusing enormously on recovering copper from old air cons, appliances, etc., etc. And they are restructuring the whole scrap reprocessing cycle, which has been populated by small operators,
Yes.
often using fraudulent invoices, etc. So the government has taken a tough line and has imposed a tax which makes these guys uneconomic. But in their place, they have an SOE which is taking over all the operations that the small processors have been doing. So scrap recovery domestically in China is a high priority because they understand that their normal countries where they import scrap from, like the EU and America, they're also looking at closing those doors.
Yeah.
So it comes back to what I think we're all saying is that scrap recycling is going to be a new growth industry.
Yeah, and it's taken a while. I mean, I've seen a lot of those import scrap processing yards in China from many years ago. I mean, we're talking about 15 years ago, and they're very messy, and they clamped down on that. And the two reasons that, as you say, one, it's an avenue for illicit sort of trade, but also they were just very messy and unhygienic. And China appears to have set up dedicated centers to exactly extract spent waste in a much more considered way.
Yeah.
I suppose the other element in filling the gap is demand destruction, and I know, Simon, you have some pretty firm views on that. You think the price has run well ahead of itself, and that copper's going to shoot itself in the foot. But
we have been around for rather a long time.
Well,
and we've
yeah,
seen
but we
what
still,
has happened in the past.
yeah,
But let
I
me,
know
let
that's
me,
true.
because demand destruction is actually happening in China now. And the numbers are pretty big from what I'm piecing together. In two particular end uses, low voltage cable. There's always been from time to time talk that aluminium will replace copper. And in periods of high prices, some of that took place. But now it is a real move. And the second big change is the use of aluminium tubing in air cons. If you recall, Andy, a few years ago, Daikin, the world's largest aircon producer, after 20 years of research, switched from using copper tubing to Ali tubing. Now in China, it's becoming very important. Particularly, it's first of all started on your cheaper air cons, where apparently about 60% of tubing is now alley, and it's now starting this year moving up into the higher priced air cons. So putting together the macro situation where growth is probably going to be slower than last year for all sorts of reasons, and substitution, we are probably going to see refined copper consumption in China rising not above 1% this year, compared to an increase of 3.5% last year.
Yeah, which is a long way from where it was 15 or 20 years ago. But how at the global level, I still find it hard to get my head around this. I think on the last podcast you talked about surpluses growing, and we talked also about, well, the stock accretion is there. They're not particularly big numbers in the overall context of stocks as a ratio to consumption, but they have risen, and we discussed that there's elements behind that stock rise which are not just about fundamental supply and demand. There's a financial aspect to it, hoarding financial copper, I suppose you could call it, but also the strategic stockpiling concept, which has yet to come forward. Maybe first ask Juan Carlos, is this a topic that people are going to be discussing, especially at a political level in Chile?
Well, I think so, Andy, because we can't ignore the growing pressure of the United States in Latin America, and of trying to offset the penetration of China. This is also another topic that I think is going to be very interesting. We have Chinese investments accelerating in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Peru. Sorry?
Argentina is Renaissance Argentina, yes?
Yeah, in Argentina, you already have Chinese investors in the lithium industry, which was the first mining industry developed by Argentina, but now copper is coming into the scene. And the question is whether China could have a piece of that development. So yes, besides the strategic stockpiling that I'm pretty sure is happening,
is happening or will happen.
In my opinion, it's happening, Simon. And let me give you another angle in this discussion, and is the 1 million tons of copper stockpiled in the United States.
Yes.
After the threat of this tariff, the U.S. has accumulated these 1 million tons, and I'm wondering whether the U.S. will make something to change that situation. And I think they will not.
I agree with you. The question is when.
Yeah.
I think there are greater priority things for them to do before they get to that. I think we'll see that in maybe 1 or 2 years' time.
Yeah. If you talk about strategic stockpiles in the U.S., yes, I agree with you. They will have they have another other type of priorities, but they already got these 1 million tons of copper, and I think it's a very easy way to have a strategic material in your territory. But in the case of China, Simon, and probably you have better information than us, but they already declared that they want to stockpile copper for strategic reasons. So I think that's already happening, in my opinion. So
yeah,
it's an important aspect.
Let me go on, Andy.
What's there that's visible, and what's hidden behind the scenes?
That's another question. That's another question. But
That's the big question for China.
yes,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
On numbers,
And-
very, very, very rough numbers, but putting different things together, I reckon that China's invisible copper cathode stocks are somewhere between 5 and 7 million tons. And don't forget that China has access to every year to surplus Russian cathode, and it's probably around 600,000 to 800,000 tons a year. Some people tell me that it's actually already in China, which comes through unreported channels like the PLA. So there is a lot going on in that part of the world that is, as you said before, completely invisible.
Yeah.
Yes.
And look at
Okay. So
the.
look, we're
Sorry.
carry on, Juan Carlos.
No, just to close the discussion here on China, it's interesting that they very they are active purchaser of copper at a certain level. When the copper price fell down up to certain level, Chinese players start to buy. You know, so
Yes.
you can see a strategy. You know, a broader strategy around copper in China.
I'm not so sure that that's part of the overall strategy. It's more Chinese
Okay, trading strategies.
long-term trading strategy.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, but
there's certainly one thing in my experience you can say about China. It does have a plan, and
Yes.
that plan is of long duration. I'm not quite convinced that that is true of some other geographies, but we'll come back to that. We're sort of on
Andy,
the
can
edge
I just follow on something you said
of
about stocks versus consumption?
yes.
If you take the 3 exchange stock levels as they are today, relative to last year's refined copper consumption, they actually represent 4.9%. And if you go back to the 22-23 period and earlier, they averaged around 0.8%. That
I mean,
in
that was
itself,
an anomalous period. There was no stocks, essentially. How you define stocks is an interesting
no
one.
reported stocks.
And obviously it's a ratio. So we come back to the outlook for demand. There's a bit of an anecdote here as a consequence of the crisis in the Middle East or in the Gulf of Hormuz specifically, that a friend of mine who works for a large distribution company that sells all sorts of products into the DIY and consumer sectors was surprised by a sudden surge in the demand for gardening materials. And this is
They have
Australia.
obviously been listening to my podcast.
So there's a rush of people going out and buying basically compost and seeds to grow their own vegetables. So the food prices here I don't think they've risen noticeably, but people are perceiving that they will. So the behaviors are all built on that expectation, which brings us back to, well, our beautiful copper. What do you think the expectations are? I haven't seen what the price is 5 minutes ago, but it's very volatile. We're clearly not going to be able to advise anyone in terms of specifics, and we shouldn't. But we should expect volatility at the very least, yes?
Well, obviously, a lot depends on how long this crisis lasts. But I think even if there was an end to the crisis in the next 2 to 3 weeks, it's going to be some time before supply chains can get back to some
Yes.
form of normalcy. I think that growth of consumption, if one is being realistic, will be less than last year. And
Yes.
that is the optimistic view. I think you can paint a very realistic scenario where there is no growth in consumption. I've quoted China as not more than 1%. I'm not saying the rest of the world will be the same, but it ain't going to be a rosy year for consumption. And that, of course, then leads into, if that's the case, are we still operating in a surplus? And what does that
That's
mean
a
for prices?
that's a good question. I mean, the mine supply part of the equation, at the very least, has been weak, but scrap has come in and filled some of the gap through to the final product level. But I read a paper by a gentleman called James Gutman of the Carlyle Group recently. I haven't read it deeply, but his as a leading energy analyst, he's saying that the push towards especially localized alternative sources, let's say, to oil and fossil fuels, will be accelerated. And the renewable energy drive at the mining level is clearly a well-established pattern that will most certainly be rapidly accelerated, the shift away from reliance on diesel. Juan Carlos, I think that's going to be something that certainly the miners in Chile are going to be talking about a lot.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's a good opportunity to explain what's the situation here. And in the last 10 years, the Chilean mining industry has signed, I think, in a 90% contract to get supply from renewable energy sources.
Mm.
So let's say from the energy supply perspective, the mining industry in Chile is let's say disconnected from hydrocarbon sources.
Yes.
So that's an important thing. Of course, this was driven by environmental concerns, all the emission discussion. But at the end of the day, the result was more practical and and
Yeah.
from a geopolitical perspective, has been an improvement. But of course, the next step here and the main challenge is the operation of trucks and heavy equipment, which is still linked to diesel. And in this aspect, uh, most of the companies are trying to develop alternatives based on electricity. It could be trolley system or battery storage system. Other people is thinking in hydrogen sources. But to be honest, my impression is that the technical advancement of these technologies is not good enough, and I still see 10 years of testings to replace fuels and things in the mining operations.
So still, I mean, those costs come through and are passed on ultimately. They obviously affect the development profile, but in terms of the impact on the copper price, I presume they sort of pass through.
Juan Carlos, how
Yes.
much does diesel account for costs in mines?
6% in average. But
Sorry,
of course,
how much?
6%.
6%.
6%.
Thank you.
But of course, you have a big dispersion. Open pit, deep
Yeah.
deposits are much more dependent on diesel than underground operations, of course. So this is an average that hidden
So the
a
impact
completely different.
the impact is at the individual mine level and where you sit on that cost curve.
Yes.
To weather the storm if one comes. But at these prices, surely most miners are making reasonable margins.
Yeah, well, price helps, and yeah, certainly. But the cost increase is
Significant.
is not, yeah, it's not a small amount. And
It's not small.
I'm
Okay.
very, just to explain something particular of Chile. Chile had an stabilization fund for fuels, and the new government dropped this system, and the result of that was a 75% increase in the cost of diesel in Chile.
Wow.
And on top of that, Chile introduced a tax on fuels after one of our many earthquakes to recover the infrastructure. Of course, the tax is still here, but the mining industry was exempted of this tax until now. Now the government decided to apply this tax to the industry. So the mining industry in Chile is having a double effect: the end of the stabilization fund and the introduction of this tax to the industry. So Chile will have a more significant impact on the cost structure than other countries.
So miners.
If I could
miners
just add,
need
go on, Andy.
Carry on, Simon. No, we're
Well,
just.
Carlos, if I could just add to that,
Yes.
from a friend of mine who's in the DRC at the moment.
Yeah.
Diesel is already not only prices soaring, but is in short supply, and it will impact production, copper production in the DRC in the near future.
Yeah. That's a very important comment, because I mentioned the particularities of the supply chain in Chile. But certainly,
Yes.
Simon, I can imagine that Africa is facing a completely different situation, different providers, much challenging, logistic situations. So we need to pay attention to that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, gentlemen, we're close to calling this a wrap.
Okay.
I guess we come back to Dwight Eisenhower's comment that if you're in the business, you need to acknowledge that plans are worthless, but the process of planning is important because we are having to make contingencies all the time, and that's in every walk of life, I think, in this current crisis. Last comments from each of you. Where are we heading with the copper price over the very next short term? And last time I said by next Friday. Let's make it by tomorrow afternoon.
Well, it depends on Mr. Trump. It depends on how Mr. Trump works up,
And that's unpredictable and
Yes.
non-forecastable. Yeah, Simon.
Well, my take is that we did operate in a surplus environment last year. We operated in a surplus environment in 24. We're probably going to be operating in a surplus environment this year, with the likelihood that inflation is going to be rising. The cost of money is not going to be falling, it's likely to be rising. already banks are tightening up their loan facilities, and that includes companies that are holding metal outside the reporting system. Do we get to a point where they are forced to liquidate? And therefore, my sense is that we will see lower copper prices before we see higher copper prices, which will probably start, if we're lucky, in the fourth quarter.
Well,
Yeah,
on that
well,
note, sorry, carry on.
no, Andy,
Last comment.
very, very last comment, and probably not so so significant, but it's hard for me to see a big move in the copper price in the short term. I think yes, impacts on demand are real, but at the same time, supply also will be also affected. So I think we will have to wait for some time until the market normalize and we can make a fundamental analysis again. That's my opinion, Andy.
It all comes back to what's going to happen in my neck of the woods.
Yes, and on that note, what happens in your neck of the woods, I hope it turns out in both yours and our technical guru Salman's favor. It's a shame, and it is a tragedy what's going on, in my humble opinion. But for the plans of mice and men. Anyway, we are the World Copper Podcast, and if you want to find out more about us, we'll be back every month. Check out our website on www.theworldcopper.com. We leave you in safe hands, hopefully, and safe travels, and we'll see you again.